Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar from LRQA on the lifecycle perspective in ISO 14001. My name is Louise Hollings, I'm a marketing manager at LRQA and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You can submit your text questions to our presenters by typing into the question pane of the control panel. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and go through as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We'll also be running a couple of polls today. Please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage on the screen. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Katerina Liana started her career in the field of electrical engineering and has worked in assurance and certification for over 30 years across a wide range of standards and schemes covering quality, environmental management, health and safety, energy management, business continuity, sustainability, and more. Katerina joined LRQA in 2005, working in a variety of increasingly senior technical management roles. As core product technical manager, Katerina leads the end-to-end technical management for a range of international standards at LRQA, including ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. Her role includes technical support to the assessment team, providing training, ensuring accreditation requirements are met, input into product strategy, and customer experience. And our second speaker today is Sarah Eyre. Sarah is a highly skilled professional with over 23 years expertise in EMS training and assessment. Sarah is a chartered environmentalist, a full member of IEMA, and a registered EMS lead auditor. As an EMS trainer, Sarah has designed and delivered an extensive range of comprehensive training programs, equipping individuals with the necessary knowledge and skills to respond effectively in the environmental management field. Sarah has a genuine passion for teaching, and her ability to communicate complex concepts such as aspects evaluation in a clear and concise manner have made her a much sought after trainer. Sarah is also a qualified ISO 14001 assessor. She has conducted numerous assessments, providing organisations with valuable feedback on their management systems and helping them to drive improvements. Sarah's expertise extends across various topics, including environmental regulations, sustainability practices, and risk management, and includes a wide range of industry sectors. Welcome to you both. I'll now hand over to Katerina, who will start today's presentation.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the webinar. I hope you find it useful, and both myself and Sarah will be available at the end to answer any of your questions. I'll start by shortly introducing ISO 14001 for those who are not familiar with it. It's an international standard that sets the requirements for an environmental management system. How you look at how your operations can impact either positively or negatively with the environment, how you look at your performance, compliance with regulations, and what measures and actions you can take to constantly improve environmental performance and protect the environment. When the standard was revised in 2015, there was a new concept that was introduced in the standard, which is the life cycle perspective. What is the life cycle perspective? It supports your systematic approach to environmental management and gives good insight and information to the top management of any company to build success over the long term and see how the company can contribute to sustainable development by seeing where you can control or influence the way your products or services are designed, manufactured, distributed, consumed, and disposed at the end of their life, and ensuring that environmental impacts will not unintentionally be shifted anywhere else in the life cycle perspective. So it's actually looking at all the stages, either of production, from the very beginning, acquiring, purchasing raw material until the end of life of a product. The same applies for service organizations and what you can actually do. I won't go into details because I'll hand over to Sarah, who will be talking about how this comes within the standard. Sarah, off to you.
Thank you very much. So let's just have a little look a bit more now about what the requirements are in 14,001 with regards to life cycle. I think the first thing to be really clear on at this point is that it requires you to adopt a life cycle perspective. So this is very different to carrying out a full life cycle assessment, which is a very labour intensive process and requires collation of a lot of data and such. So it's a life cycle perspective. And it's very clear within the annex of ISO 14001 that that is indeed the case. So in Annex 612, it does state that when determining environmental aspects, the organisation considers a life cycle perspective. This does not require a detailed life cycle assessment. Okay, so to be really clear on that, I think is important at this point. So an understanding of the environmental impacts across all those different life cycle stages, even if that's at quite a high level, will absolutely enable you as an organisation to concentrate your efforts on where those biggest areas of impact are. It may be that the biggest area of impact is not something that is under your direct immediate control if you're a production organisation. It might be related to end of use or disposal of product. And then obviously you can decide what are the best controls to put in place, how you can best try and influence those particular issues. The definition section of ISO 14001 in definition 3.3.3 has what I think is a really nice definition of life cycle. It really clarifies and gives us a nice set of individual kind of stages for us to consider. And those include the acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and final disposal. Okay. Now, depending on your organisation, you might be involved in all of those different life stages, or it may only be some of those that are actually applicable. So when you are identifying your aspects and impacts, the first thing you're going to need to do is consider your aspects and impacts associated with all of your activities, products and services as applicable. So some organisations may just be service-based, some may be making products but not providing services. And you need to think about those environmental aspects and their associated impacts from right at the very beginning of that life cycle process, so the acquisition of raw materials, right through to disposal. You need to determine which of those aspects and impacts are within your control and influence. There will be some perhaps that you have absolutely no control and no influence over, and those ones kind of fall outside your environmental management scope. Okay, so we're only focusing on those that you have control and influence over. And you very much need to be looking beyond your operational boundaries. You need to be thinking about both those up and downstream processes and activities, which are likely to include supply chain issues, customer issues, and particularly as well if you're outsourcing, don't forget those types of aspects and impacts and any life cycle considerations associated with those. The other area of ISO 14001 that talks about life cycle considerations is in the operational planning and control section. So this is section 8 of ISO 14001. So we can see here that it states that the organisation should consider the extent of control or influence that it can exert over the activities, products and services considering a life cycle perspective, and then put in place the appropriate controls to manage those aspects. Okay, so under aspects, we're thinking about what those actual aspects and impacts are and where those kind of fit within those life cycle stages. And then in the operational planning and control section of the standard, this is where we now think about how we will manage and control those particular issues. And the standard, I think, is quite clear here. It kind of sets out a number of considerations for us. The first part there, thinking about design and development, okay, so ensuring you've got appropriate controls to address the design and development processes, determining requirements for procurement of products and services as appropriate, communicating those environmental requirements that you've established to external providers, which may well also include your contractors. And then the final point here is that you also need to consider the need to provide information about these potential environmental impacts associated with transportation, delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and the final disposal of those products and services. So that could be providing that information to a range of different interested parties. So if we just take a little look then at the external processes and supply kind of chain issues in a little bit more detail. So I've mentioned outsourcing a couple of times already. It is a requirement within ISO 14001 that you as an organisation ensure that all outsourced processes are controlled or influenced. Now, there's obviously an understanding that you can't control the whole of that organisation that you're outsourcing to. However, those particular activities, those particular issues that they are carrying out on your behalf will fall within the scope of your EMS, and you do need to consider how you will actually go about that kind of level of control or influence. So that might be, for example, through maybe contract conditions, supplier audits, codes of practice that your supply chain may sign up to. And certainly, I think one of the things to think about is, you know, when you're selecting and evaluating your suppliers and contractors and the outsourced processes, the need to consider life cycle issues within that and the practicalities of how you will actually do that. You know, a lot of organisations will send out supply questionnaires, but I think, you know, at this point in the standard, it should also be prompting us to think a little bit more about, you know, is a supplier questionnaire that is simply, you know, received and filed actually meeting that requirement? So some brief examples of the kind of things to have a consideration or to consider. For example, here, an automotive manufacturer. So, you know, if we imagine they're assessing the environmental impacts of their vehicles, they're going to be doing that from raw material extraction, manufacturing, and use through to end-of-life disposal. And that should enable them to identify opportunities for reducing emissions, improving fuel efficiency, promoting recycling and reuse of vehicle components. So for an organisation like a vehicle manufacturer, a lot of the environmental impacts are not just in the production stage, it goes right back to the design of those vehicles that will actually have then an impact on the use and end-of-life issues of that vehicle. And by considering all those life cycle issues, you can actually minimise the impacts all the way through that life cycle chain. Another brief example here, if we were thinking about a different organisation, maybe food packaging organisation. So here their focus will be evaluating the environmental aspects of their packaging materials, including the sourcing of those, the production, the distribution, the use, and again, disposal. And by considering the life cycle issues, they can perhaps consider selecting more sustainable materials. They can look at reducing packaging waste and improving kind of the recycling processes all the way through those stages. And the third example here, construction organisations. So we would be analysing the environmental impacts of their projects there at each of the stages, from design and material selection to construction, the operation of those buildings, what they're actually going to be used for, and then the demolition at the end of life, or the deconstruction of them. And this certainly will then help to minimise resource consumption, thinking about not only eco-friendly construction techniques, but the types of materials that are used. And that's certainly something that we see a lot more of now from a construction perspective. Now I'm going to hand over to Louise now, who is just going to take us through a poll question.
Thanks, Sarah. So our first poll question for today is, to what extent do you think the life cycle perspective is covered within your organisation's environmental aspects? Not at all, to a small extent, to a moderate extent, or to a large extent. So that question again, to what extent do you think the life cycle perspective is covered already within your organisation's environmental aspects? So please select the most relevant one. You think not at all, to a small extent, to a moderate extent, or to a large extent. So thank you to everybody who's voted already. We'll just give everybody a few more seconds to get their votes in, and then we'll have a look. So thank you for your votes. Here we go. Here's the results. So we can see that nearly half of the people who are have joined us today feel that the life cycle perspective is covered to a moderate extent already. So that's great. Sarah and Katerina, do you have any comments on the results for this one?
I think it actually reflects what we see during audits as well. I don't know, Sarah, if you agree that companies are starting to consider this and taking it seriously into account, even though a life cycle assessment is not needed.
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually from kind of a sustainability perspective, more and more organisations are certainly a lot more aware of supply chain issues. And even just thinking about the materials you're using in terms of where they're coming from a supply chain, from a cost perspective, I think has meant that a number of these kind of questions are being asked by many organisations, whether or not you actually have ISO 14001. So I think it is a little more integrated through a number of different departments and areas of the business, if you like. It's not just something that just sits within the ISO 14001 side of things. So yes, I'm kind of not surprised to see the greatest percentage there sitting at that, to that moderate extent. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for taking part in this poll. We'll have one more just before the Q&A session. And as a reminder, you can submit your questions at any point through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. And I'll now hand back to Katerina, who will take you through what an auditor will be looking for in respect of the life cycle perspective.
Thank you, Louise. As Sarah pointed out before when she was giving you more details on the life cycle perspective, you won't expect an auditor to ask you if you've carried out a full life cycle assessment. It'll be more of a discussion to see if you've considered it and what actions you have been taking. So is this something that's discussed with your top management, either during operational meetings or your management review when you're looking at your performance in areas where you can introduce improvement, because decisions will need to be made and potential investments as well. So it should be something that's discussed with the top management. And we won't be only looking at your management review. We might even have that discussion with the top management, as we always try and speak with them during our audits. When you're designing new products, are you looking at the origin and choice of raw material you're making? Are you considering more sustainable material? When I choose my raw material, will there be any impact during any of the later stages after the design of product? In the chemical industry, I've seen companies introduce green chemistry developing products that end with little or no pollution or potential environmental risk, adopting sustainable chemistry as well, changing suppliers when they couldn't provide environmental safe material. And also companies, when redesigning products, they're looking into how they can use less material or energy and how they can make their products reusable or recyclable when it comes to the end of their life. So these are questions that we will be asking when you have design activities. During production, are you considering recycling any of your internal process waste, wastewater, waste heat? Are you recovering steam that can be used during production? When you're buying new equipment, if you're upgrading your facilities, are you considering equipment that is energy efficient? Are you using recyclable packaging material, or if you're not, are you considering that? And what kind of discussions are you holding with the supply chain to see what you can do? And talking about the supply chain, is they can have a big impact on your environmental performance. Do you consider selecting contractors based on their performance and not only looking at selecting the cheapest solution? Are you looking at ways where you can minimize your water usage, or considering alternative sources of energy, fossil fuel, renewables? I've seen a few of our clients that when they're reducing their energy use, they have managed to negotiate better contracts with the power companies, get better prices for them, which means they have some cost savings. And there have been cases as well where there's an impact on your insurance as well. How do you inform your clients on how to dispose products at the end of their life? Do you have any instructions or guidance that are provided with the products? Is this information available on your website? Are you providing them with potential buyback options because you can recover some material? Are you encouraging your clients and customers on recycling? Because as sustainability has become more and more of an issue and consumers are becoming more conscious of what we need to do to protect the environment, they are buying more consciously based on eco labels or after reading a company's sustainability report. If you're in the paper industry, for example, and these are things that I've seen when I was auditing companies back in Europe, are you receiving or asking your pulp suppliers to provide you certificates of sustainable forestry? So these are examples of things that we will be looking into when we carry out audits. So what are the implications for a company with the life cycle perspective that has been introduced? When you're carrying out your aspects and impacts analysis, you need to consider these from cradle to grave, from the acquisition of raw materials until the end of life disposal of product. Analyzing each stage and process to see what you can actually control, what you can change or improve, and what you can influence, because there will be some things that you might not be able to change because you rely on third parties. For example, transport companies. If you're using external parties and you're not transporting your products through your own means? Are you discussing with them the potential of changing transportation routes that will minimize emissions and will minimize cost as well? You need to involve all stakeholders, all your interested parties, start the discussions with your supply chain, and see how you can source environmentally responsible material. How you can work with your waste management partners to make sure that end-of-life treatment is responsible as well. How can you involve your clients, your customers, consumers in end product use and disposal? Another thing that's quite important is it has to do with legal compliance or compliance with any contractual requirements that you might have, is how are you managing any environmental risks and liabilities? Where are your potential sources of pollution and environmental management? How can I be proactive and avoid any potential regulatory non-compliances, fines, or any costly cleanup operations? And most important, how can I avoid any reputational damage, something that no company wants to feel and have to address? How can you better pace yourself to be able to access environmentally conscious markets when you're looking to expand your business, and how this life cycle perspective fits within your environmental management to ensure that you comply with potentially new legal or contractual requirements when you're entering new markets? How can you better meet customer and your business partner expectations as the demand for environmental and responsible products has increased a lot over the last years? So these are things that you will need to consider. And of course, when you do take this approach, you will actually see a number of benefits. This more holistic approach you take on environmental management helps you identify and prioritize your environmental hotspots and see where you have improvement opportunities at each stage of the production of your product or the offering of your service. Your sustainability performance will be enhanced. You can go beyond traditional end-of-pipe environmental measures and focus on sustainable practices all throughout the value chain. You can make more informed decisions and implement measures and controls that can minimize your environmental footprint. As I said before, it enhances regulatory compliance as well, and reduces the likelihood of any legal or reputational repercussions. You will see cost savings for sure when you identify opportunities for resource optimization, waste reduction, energy efficiency. Using and implementing sustainable practices like eco-design, waste minimization, recycling, you will actually see a lot of benefits and cost savings. Product and process innovation, developing greener materials, greener products. This will also help enhancing your reputation, your position in the market, make you a leader in sustainability. This enhances your brand image and increases the confidence and the trust that your customers will have you as a company. And eventually that means increase of confidence of society overall as well. and it will provide you with a competitive advantage, and you might see some reduced premiums as well, as insurers take into account good environmental performance. And for some markets, and there are jurisdictions that require companies to assess and disclose their environmental impact. So considering the life cycle perspective can make sure that you address legal compliance and help you get into new markets, of course. And coming to the end of the webinar, let's take a look at a few of the key points that we discussed today and provided some insight on both myself and Sarah. 14001 is a flexible framework that helps you integrate this life cycle perspective within your environmental management practices. And as Sarah stated before, you won't need to carry out a full life cycle assessment. You won't be expecting any auditor asking you to see such an assessment. As I said before, we will be discussing your approach to see if it's more holistic and sustainable. And if you're at the beginning, we'll encourage you to take a deeper look at all stages of production, of service delivery, to see what you can actually change, improve, or how you can influence your supply chain or your business partners. The benefits that companies see from taking this perspective into account and moving from the narrow focus on operations to consider more broader environmental applications. It's all about making the right choices when it comes to the environment, the economy, and society overall, because everybody is part of society. Yourself, your business partners, your supply chain, and consumers and your customers as well. Considering the life cycle perspective increases your resilience, your continuity, your risk management, and promotes innovation, of course, through the identification of opportunities at each stage of your operations. And it's something I would strongly suggest you consider during your next discussions, during your next management review meeting, during the next review of your aspects and impacts analysis, something I'm pretty sure that Sarah will also agree with. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Katerina. And before we start the Q&A, we'd just like to ask you one more poll question. So, will your organisation be looking for any of the following assurance or training services in the next 12 months? And you can select all that apply. So the options we have here for you today are ISO 14001 gap analysis or certification, ISO 50001 energy management gap analysis or certification, integrated management system certification, training, or carbon emissions verification. So those options again for any services that you might be looking for in the next 12 months. So 14001 environmental management gap analysis or certification, ISO 50001 energy management gap analysis or certification, integrated management system certification, any training that you might be looking for in the next 12 months, or carbon emissions verification. So thank you to everybody who's voted already. We'll just give you a few more seconds. And then we'll move over to the Q&A. You can see that some responses still coming through. So thank you to everybody who's taken part in the polls today. It's much appreciated. Okay. I think we can stop the poll there. So thank you again for taking part in the poll. So quite a split there. So thank you for taking part in the poll. It's now our turn to answer your questions. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So Sarah, our first question is for you. How can we demonstrate that we're controlling or influencing life cycle approach issues in our supply chain?
Yes, so I think that's quite an interesting one. It depends on who your supply chain is, and certainly it depends on that level of influence that you have. It might come down to trying to demonstrate through some of those questions. We mentioned the questionnaire earlier. I think it's important to think quite carefully about what questions you ask of your supply chain and how you're actually going to use that information. So if you are going to send out questionnaires to your supply chain, do so carefully, because we do expect an evaluation of those responses and for those to be used within the business decision-making process. Supply chain issues might include how often things are delivered to you. It might include the sources that your supply chain are using themselves, so the kind of provenance of materials. It might be looking at maybe more environmentally friendly alternatives with your supply chain. It might be how things are packaged. It might be frequency of delivery. So all these are many things that you could look at within supply chain, and how you might demonstrate that. We would see kind of some of those issues within your aspects and impacts registers. We would see evidence of those discussions and maybe kind of in the types of materials that you're purchasing, maybe changes in that over a period of time. Many organisations will have change management processes, so there might be some formal change management processes that you have been through in the case of maybe looking at using alternative materials. So there could be a number of different ways. And, you know, from an assessor's perspective, we're very flexible to look at a whole range of different approaches. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, I don't think, and I'm sure Katerina would agree with that. You know, what it will look like for one organisation compared to another will be different. And I just want to remind everybody that it is about influence rather than direct control. There will be some things that you know, of course, absolutely cannot change, but it's about trying to demonstrate initially through those aspects and impact registers the range of things that you've looked at, and then trying to exert that influence where possible with your supply chain. And it might be that the supply chain comes back to you for whatever the inquiry or reason was, that they're not able to accommodate that. And that's life, isn't it? You know, it's about trying to demonstrate where you can that you've explored those options. It might not always be possible and realistic at the end of the day for all of those initiatives to actually be taken forward.
Thank you, Sarah. Katerina, our next question is for you, and it's around how you look at this for a service organisation. So Amina has asked, can the life cycle approach be applied in the service industry, for example, with a consultancy firm? And if so, how, please? Thank you.
It can be implemented in any business sector. It might be a little bit more easier or challenging for a service organization. You just need to look at the various components of your service activities. For a consultancy firm, for example, you offer consultancy or training services. You're involved in projects with your clients. You might be commuting to your clients or to sites, see how you can minimize transportation, routes. When you don't have an end-of-life product like you have with a production company, so that's something that is not really applicable unless you're a service organization that provides repair services at client sites, where you can look into how you handle any service-related waste or byproducts that can be created, how you can reduce use of natural resources, stop printing, using electronic documents, little things that you can do when you're a service organization. If you're in the food service industry, for example, you can start looking at getting local organic ingredients, for example, from local suppliers that implement responsible practices. Or if you're in the hospitality industry, with again is considered a service organization, how can you use environmental friendly cleaning products when you're cleaning rooms in the hotel, for example? How can you reduce water consumption? Things like that apply to the service organization. Sarah,
Thanks.
I don't know if you agree or would like to add anything.
I guess my comment, again, as I alluded to earlier, is that not all of these life cycle stages will be applicable to every organisation, and that's fine. Don't feel that you've got to try and kind of force, if you like, a consideration of some of these things where there isn't that level of control or influence, or where it's just not applicable. But depending on what that consultancy kind of organisation does, I mean, there could still be design issues. So in terms of project design, there could be more, environmental considerations in the design of things. And then rather than kind of end of life, you could almost think about follow-up activities to some degree from that side of things. You mentioned training organisation, Katerina, kind of briefly in a few moments ago. That could be down to the design of the training packages. It might be things like, being able to do something online rather than necessarily face-to-face. It could be about how you make those training materials available. So, rather than it being kind of paper and such that's maybe going to sit on a shelf and not be used, maybe electronic media. If you're an engineering consultancy, then obviously design for environment is a really big thing. So you've got quite a lot of opportunity there to look at things, including, the design for end of life issues still. So although you're not doing the manufacturing, the opportunity to influence through those life cycle stages, including the selection of materials and such, is still there. Obviously, I don't have the detail of the type of organisation and such, but there will be a way to show some consideration. But just remember, it may not be applicable for all of those life cycle stages, and that's fine.
Thank you both. I think that's actually answered a couple of the other questions that we've had coming in. So I'm going to move back to Katerina. So we've got a question from Alan here. He's currently integrating ISO 9001, 14001 and 50001 into one management system. And he's asked if these can all be audited as one system or will they have to be audited separately?
Since you're moving to one management system, which means you're going to have an integrated management system, what we do as an organization, and I believe a lot of other certification bodies do as well, but our approach would be to carry out an integrated audit, which means that we would have a team that can cover all the standards, and that means that we will be avoiding duplication during an audit. So you will have one person looking at what we call the management elements, internal audits, management review, and you won't have different people looking at from a 9001 perspective or 14 or 50, or whatever other management system you introduce. And that's something we encourage our clients to do as well, to go for integrated management system. It saves cost and resources internally as well. And there is a prerequisite. We need to make sure that it's the same group of people or the same person making decisions for the whole management system. So you might have people that might be a little bit more focused on environmental management or health and safety within that group, but it needs to be one group or one person having the overall responsibility for the system to talk about 100% integration. But we would carry out an integrated audit. We would not be looking at each standard separately, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katerina. So Sarah, I'll come back to you now. Do you think that the life cycle focus is due to ESG and cyclical economy requirements being laid on the supply chain? That's a question from Simon.
I think certainly organisations are a lot more aware of these issues because of you know, a number of these things that we see a lot more. There's a lot more about kind of the circular economy out there. But I would say, you know, even going back to the previous versions of 14001, there has always been this requirement to consider those areas of not just control but influence. So I'd argue actually that life cycle and that kind of approach has always been there. It just hasn't been as clearly stated as it is now in the standards. So, you know, from an organisation perspective, good practice has always been to have a look at pushing those boundaries environmentally in terms of your supply chain and end of use. 14001 has always required you to identify the aspects and impacts under your direct control and under your influence, which would include supplies and kind of end of life customer use issues. So I think it certainly helped focus many organisations' minds perhaps along these lines, because there's a lot more out there from a media perspective, a lot more kind of, I guess, financial discussions around these issues than perhaps there was previously. But I would argue it has always been there, and it's just more supported now, and I think just more widely communicated. I don't know if Katerina, do you have anything to add?
I'd fully agree with you. I think you hit the nail.
Great. So, Katerina, where is the best place to capture any life cycle considerations within your management system, or like more specifically, how to evidence it? Michelle has asked.
Okay, so the standard doesn't exactly say where you need to capture this and how to capture it. And like any other standard, it provides flexibility. So it's up to you to decide. If, for example, you have design activities, you design new products, these would be discussions within the design team, and if there are investments or needed or major changes either in processes because of the design of these new products, this would probably be discussed during management team meetings, because top management needs to be involved, especially when there's cost involved. They're the ones that will take decisions because they will be giving the money. You can use your aspects and impacts register if you wanted to document how you've considered, which might be the best way. It's up to you to decide what suits better the company. I think it's usually within the aspects and impacts register that we see companies taking this into consideration. So that would be a suggestion. It's not a must. If you find a better way during team meetings, or if you want to introduce documentation that is specifically linked to the life cycle perspective, it's up to you. But my recommendation would be in the aspects and impacts register. It's much easier for yourselves as well, because that's something you review when you have changes in technology, in your processes, in your materials. You need to review it. There might be new regulations that might have an impact as well on your impacts and aspects analysis. So that would be the best document to use for recording.
Great. So as a follow-on to that, Michelle has asked, in the aspects and impacts register, would you expect to see a life cycle consideration or comment against every aspect?
No, Sarah, go ahead.
No, I not necessarily at all, and it's not really that a comment on life cycle against the aspect, but that the aspect itself is maybe associated with a life cycle issue. So your aspect, or you might have identified aspects and impacts associated with design. You don't need to do anything else life cycle for design other than it's on there, it's on your aspects register. We can see that you've considered life cycle issues because design has been evaluated on your aspects register. So we're not looking for, you know, each aspect to have a separate life cycle set of considerations given to it, but just to see that the issues you have on your aspects register include a range of those within the whole of the life cycle. So that might be including supply chain management or where you're purchasing materials from. It might be to do with waste disposal issues. It might be end of life disposal kind of via customer. It could be outsourced activities. So as long as they're there on your aspects register, you don't need to flag particular life cycle issues, as long as we can see on that aspects register there are a range of life cycle issues considered. I hope that makes sense.
Fantastic, thank you. So we had a couple of questions come in around kind of measurement and KPIs. So I'm going to try and group them together because I appreciate we're kind of running out of time. There's still quite a few questions. So the first one from Marta is around what environmental KPIs a small business could monitor, if you've got any examples from businesses you've worked with. And then the second one around measurement is around like measures for the influence they have on their supply chain. So are there any KPIs that organizations could use for that?
Energy reduction, targets for energy efficiency and reducing your, even if you're a small company, increasing recycling, using energy efficient materials. Sarah, I don't know if you can think of any more.
Yeah, so, and obviously it depends on what your organisation is and what your issues are. So, you know, you need to be thinking about why are you monitoring and measuring? What's the purpose of that within ISO 14001? So, you know, the monitoring and measurement, the KPI side of it is to be able to either kind of get a handle on quantities of something, so you can decide how and where you might want to implement additional controls, or to look at making improvements. So I think kind of the question really about KPIs very much depends on, well, what are the issues within your business? What kind of things do you need to monitor and measure and therefore set KPIs against? Now that might be things like energy and waste and such. It might be things like the number of non-conformities that have been raised in an audit, or the number of outstanding non-conformities that have gone past kind of a timescale. That might be an appropriate KPI. It might be the number of maybe kind of people who are outstanding to have obtained training to certain levels and such. So there could be kind of what we would term operational KPIs. There could be management type KPIs. But, you know, I would very much say before you start setting KPIs, you need to be thinking about what's the purpose of them? What benefit is that going to be to our organisation? How is that information actually going to help us either manage those risks better or to help us improve our environmental performance?
So I would add that they'll probably be linked to aspects and impacts in any high risk areas as well. So that would be the focus of any company. It's not just setting KPIs to measure things to show to any external party. They need to make sense.
Louise, can you just tell me the second part of the questions about supply chain?
Yeah, sure. So it was around how can we measure the level of influence we have on our supply chain?
I think that's a really difficult one. I think it depends on sometimes how big you are as an organisation, you know, how important you are to supply chain. It's about that level of influence. It's about trying to demonstrate you are exerting that influence where you can. It's not always something that's entirely possible to measure. However, if you are a large organisation and you know you're an important customer within that supply chain, then obviously your level of influence is greater. But I think you have to use a logical and pragmatic approach. It's not a very specific answer, I'm afraid, for that one. But Katerina, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts for that.
No, I would agree that that's quite challenging and difficult to actually measure, and I don't know how much sense and value it would give to a company to set a KPI to actually measure that influence, because you can demonstrate if you've had influence by changing the perspective of a supplier and making them take a more environmental responsible approach, looking at certifications perhaps, or making their products more environmental friendly, changing their approach, which is not again easy to measure as well. So it is challenging, quite challenging. And as we said before, you don't need to measure everything.
So we've had a few more questions come in about integrated management systems. So the first one's from Jake. He's asked, if applying for ISO 14001 certification, where we already have 9001 certification, am I okay to leave the areas already covered by 9001 if I haven't requested an integrated audit?
You can make use of the common processes if you have procedures for corrective action management, for example, which would address any environmental incident or event that might happen, as long as it's clear that they address environmental management as well. You don't need to duplicate procedures. There's no sense in it. So you can make use of your existing documentation and processes for sure.
Okay. And so, Sarah, the next one's on a similar theme from Timu. Risk assessment in ISO 14001 is very unique with its aspect and impact assessment. But when combining certifications for 9001, 14001, 45001, 27001, and 35001, that's a lot. Is there an easy way to integrate these, as they're all very specific in the field of what is required in the point of view of risks? They've got an integrated management system, but the way the risks are handled is segregated, which is making it very labour intensive. So any advice there or any tips?
I'm going to give a really short answer to this, which is maybe a little bit of a get out, I'm afraid, from my perspective. But I think the key is to keep it simple. You know, there isn't a one size fits all approach necessarily. It is difficult, but I certainly see very complex risk assessments that are not necessary for the purposes of the standard. So I think the first question you need to ask yourselves as an organisation when you're trying to integrate these is, of what value is the methodologies that you're currently using? Because it's one of my gripes of the complexity and how hard some organisations make things for themselves. It's not a requirement of the standard. Some organisations will use a qualitative rather than a quantitative approach for assessing aspects and impacts and their significance that can work just as well as a very complex numerical risk assessment. So I think kind of the short answer is it's not easy to do. You might not be able to just have one assessment that covers everything, possibly. but keep it simple. Whatever approach you use, you will have a much better chance of having if you like, a generic assessment, at least maybe as a first filter for some of these things, by trying to keep that as simple as possible and pulling out those key issues.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm afraid we've reached the top of the hour, so we've got through most of the questions, but there are a few that we haven't had a chance to get through. So I will share those with Katerina and Sarah, and we'll try to respond individually to those last few questions that we didn't get through to today. So thank you, Katerina and Sarah, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.